This is Brian from BRP, and here's a detailed look at this KP31 fire control group as used in the Stemple 76-45 submachine guns. It's pretty simple, as most subgun fire control groups go. It fires from the open bolt, so what happens is you have a catch surface on the bottom of your bolt, the square edge here, and you have a sear. So when you pull the trigger, it lowers the sear, and the bolt can lunge forward on the spring, and then it will only stop moving when the sear pops up again to grab it. The Suomi KP31 fire control group is a bit unique. It does not have a disconnector that intersects with the bolt during movement. So in most guns, let's say a open bolt full auto, when you pull the trigger, there will be a disconnector at the front here. When the bolt comes forward and trips it, it'll pop the sear up again. Now with this finished KP31 system, that is built into this piece here, which is controlled by your trigger movement. So we're going to get into some detailed parts in this thing, which it might feel a little tricky at first, but after you see it, it's actually quite simple. And all the disconnector system is built into the trigger. So when you pull the trigger in semi-auto, see here's full auto, so sear goes straight up and down. And then in semi-auto, which is one click back, I'm going to put my finger here because this part on the rear will disconnect from the sear and allow the sear to pop up. So if you notice, it slides off the back. It's almost like a flicking movement. And then all the way back, there's a bar that prevents sear movement here, so the sear only has a limited amount of movement. So we don't have a lot of real estate here. The sear is about this wide. We have about 0.1 inch of movement, which is all that's engaging this bolt assembly. So when you pull the trigger, the sear will drop approximately 0.1 inch, and then the bolt can lunge forward. And then in semi-auto, this is where a really important feature on these you got to pay attention to. You can't feather the triggers on these, because let's say you pull it down just a bit and the sear falls off, and then you're only going between minor engagement. You're not spreading out the load on the surface on your bolt over the amount of surface where you need on your sear. So let's say instead of engaging your bolt by 0.1 inch, you're only engaging it by half of that. So that's when you start seeing wear on parts. So the thing on any fire control group based on a Suomi is you have to fully pull and fully release the trigger. So in full auto, that would look like this. You don't want to just kind of feather it, to where it just lets off, where you're only half engaging the bolt. So it's always fully pull, fully release. And that goes the same for semi-auto. So in semi-auto, when you pull the trigger, it drops the sear down, 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 and then pops up again. So at approximately 90% of the length of the pull, that's when the sear will drop down low enough to let the bolt go forward. And it's extra 10% of pull that allows it to pop back up. So let's show you how to disassemble it off of the machine gun. So first thing is we just have to separate the upper and lower. But before I do that, let me show you what it looks like when you're actually in the gun. So selector's on full. You can pull the bolt back, it locks on the sear, you pull the trigger, the bolt will just lunge forward and keep going until I release the trigger, then it resets itself. In semi-auto, you pull the trigger, and I'm just going to slowly pull, and it drops off, and then it's the extra follow through that resets it. And if I feather it just right where I can hit it, where it will drop the bolt, hear that extra click? That was the disconnector separating from the sear and the sear popping up on its own spring. So with the selector and semi and the bolt forward, you should hear clicks. That is the sound of the sear separating from the disconnector on the trigger and re-engaging. And that loud thing you're hearing is this bouncing off the reset inside of this housing. So in an original KP31, they had a charging handle that would ride over this, and that's why there's that big cutout there. In the Stemple guns, we're using a fixed block inside of here to act as a stop surface for the sear upward movement. Because if the sear goes up too far, Let me let it up. Your disconnector won't engage and it'll be stuck like that. So basically just have a dead trigger in the gun. That hook has to come up and grab. So let's get into this thing. So separating the parts here, you first want to get out your mag housing. And then, depending on which version you have, this is a screw type. This is one of the older ones. I'm going to take the rear takedown screw out, and we can just separate that. Put the machine gun receiver and the rest of it off to the side here. And now we're looking at this system, and this is just the trigger pack in here. Kind of see what's going on. And this big block here is the reset surface. So in semi, you can see it. And in full, the full slaves the disconnector and sear together so the disconnector doesn't drop off. And in safe, again, there's that bar preventing the movement of the sear, and it only moves just a slight amount, not enough to let the bolt lunge forward. So to get the trigger pack out of here, there's a screw on the side, and the screw is it's a securing screw really to take vibration out. If you notice, there's how this is machined, the radius of the tube actually holds it all together, and this part's actually on a slot. So the screw just prevents vibration when that's in there. And then we're looking at the trigger pack just inserted there. You can see the stop surface. There, that's our sear stop surface. Now, just a quick note, in old versions, there's this threaded hole in the top for a set screw to be put in there to actually put more downward pressure on that. But what that does is it will move this whole assembly down and limit the amount of engagement we have on the bolt. Remember, we only have 0.1 inch of movement, and we're going to use every bit of that. So this screw hole doesn't get used for anything. On the other side, this on the bottom, there's a set screw here. This is very important. This pushes up on the trigger pack to keep it tight so the back of the sear is resting on the sear stop surface. So to take this out, and on a quick note, it's really important with these things that if you have the selector on semi, you always want to brace it here, because otherwise your sear is going to go flying across the room. You're going to probably lose a spring and the detent underneath of it. So I'll follow my own rules and put that back off a semi. So with this screw loosened, you don't ever have to take it out. How you get this out is you just turn it upside down and tap it on this edge on the table. And sometimes they're tighter than others. This one just falls out, but let me show that again. And to put it back in, just the opposite. So the tail end goes in first, then it just drops in. Sometimes you have to push it down here to where you get it flat. And the cover plate will act as a check. It'll let you know if you did it right or wrong. So the cover plate should go down and over all these parts. The nice thing about this whole setup is all the pins are just retained by the housing. So these just push right out so you can get to all the inside parts. So let's get this guy apart and take a close look at everything. So first thing, we want to take the thing that's under main pressure out of it so we can make sure this thing is safe to handle. So what I'm going to do is hold the sear, pull back on the disconnector so the sear separates. And then we're looking at the sear in the up position. Just going to take a pin punch. This is an 1/8 inch. This is for the large sear axis pin. Punch that out. And what we're looking at is our sear and sear spring. And that fits in there like that. And then in here, what we have is a plunger, which is actually a guide rod for the mainspring for your sear. And also on the underside of that, just dump that out. And just so you can see it, inside of the gun, that sits like that. And there's a radiused bottom part here. And what that does is goes through this body and into your selector. And if you notice, there's little divots inside the selector here. And that's how you get the clicking on that movement. Notice this just floats free because there's no spring pressure or detent on that. So the rest of these pins, we're going to use a 3/32 punch just to push them out. Sometimes they're tight, sometimes they're not. If they're tight, it's good to have a punch block nearby and you can just drive them out. So there's 2 pins that hold the selector assembly in there, and there's 1 pin that holds the trigger. So I'm going to arrange these kind of as they be inside of the trigger pack. We'll just put the pins aside. And this, to get this out, just push it from the bottom through the top. So there's our disconnector, our safety. I'm going to yank this spring out of here, and we'll just put the detent under there as a reference. So in safe, you can see this bar here prevents the sear from moving. In semi, let me arrange this here. On the disconnector, this leg on the disconnector will pivot off of this surface on your selector. So close up here. As you pull the trigger in semi, as that pulls back, this will come down and then pivot off, and that's where your disconnection is. So these are pretty slick surfaces, and in full auto, this is just farther forward. You remember, all 3 clicks, well, 2 clicks all the way forward is full. So in full, this part on your disconnector never touches your safety bar. And looking at the detent function here, you can see how this slips in these holes here, and that's how you get your safety clicks. So all the way forward full, 1 click back, semi, oh, I did that backwards. That would be fully forward, that would be semi, and that would be safe. So full, semi, safe. One of the things that people sometimes complain about the Suomi trigger packs is that these pushes are often pretty tight. You got to push pretty hard to move that selector. If you ever want to remedy that, all you do is you can buff down this tip so that it glides over these holes better. And there's 2 different versions of this. This is the hole type, and there's ones that have slots, but they do the same thing and all the parts are interchangeable. So when we're looking at these Suomi trigger packs, there are a few things we need to contend with. One is, when the trigger is fully pulled, we need to make sure that the bolt can go forward. And then in semi-auto, we want to make sure that the bolt comes down enough to let the bolt go forward, but not so far down before the trip that you have a lot of lag. So what we're aiming for is almost a simultaneous, when you reach the end of the trigger pull in semi, the bolt lunges forward and this resets at the same time. We don't want a lot of lag there, because what can happen is limited sear engagement to a bolt contact, which will wear out your bolt catch surface and also wear this out over time. So if we have a situation where the sear is, we're pulling the trigger in full auto and the sear is not coming down far enough to let the bolt go forward, what we'll do is we'll machine down the surface and then polish it and put a slight radius on this edge. And step it down usually 3/1000ths at a time till we hit that magic number. Then what we'll do is we'll need to make sure it works in semi. And in semi, again, you don't get the full trigger pull before it resets and pops back up on itself. So we might have to lower it just a bit more to function in semi. And it varies trigger pack to trigger pack. Some trigger packs, you just drop them in and they just work. Others, we have to do quite a bit to them. On this one, I can already tell just by the marks on here and the polishing that this one was machined down. And we do it on a mill just to be precise with a DRO, and radiused. And then on the back end of it, sometimes this surface has to be adjusted too. So if we ever have a situation where inside of the gun, let's say this happens. Now, I purposely did not tighten the screw just to simulate this thing. See, the disconnector hook did not re-engage on the surface, on the sear. So, what we'll have to do in that situation is machine this surface at the appropriate angle, just down by a couple thousandths of an inch, so this can re-engage. And this points me to something else. It's very important that the screw here is always tight, because we always need to be pushing up on this assembly inside of the housing to make sure that the sear can hit that stop surface and reconnect. So without the screw, oh, dead trigger, not going to work. But when I tighten the screw right here, this is only in semi, I'll get my, that's proper semi-auto function. So we're dealing with a couple things with these trigger packs. Is proper semi-function within the trigger pack, that it is properly flicking the sear. Because again, there's no positive disconnector like in some other trigger packs where you pull the trigger, then it waits to, the bolt will hit a disconnector, then pop it back up on semi. What we're dealing with is this flicking motion. So first of all, we have to make sure that it flicks, and then when it does flick, it's only releasing the bolt at that last instant when the sear drops down far enough and pops back up. So we almost want to make the bolt drop simultaneous with that. But you know, one of the most important things to remember here is this screw always has to be tight. Usually torque will take care of it, but if you want to use, you know, blue or purple Loctite, you know, very low strength, because these are very fine threads, it's only 832 in there. You can put that on, just don't put a lot, because you do want to be able to loosen this without having to go crazy. You know, breaking wrenches off in there. And you know, it's only one to two turns, or I should say half turns, just to do it. So that's tight. And then let's take it a half turn off, and then I can just remove it. So let's get a little bit deeper into this. So we've already gone over how the sear works. This is your axis here. So as you're doing it, and the trigger's pulling here, so what you're doing is you're pulling that down. And how the selector bar works to safe the gun here, and how it works in semi to pivot off this lever here to release the disconnector from the tail on this. So the disconnector will grab that, and then when it pivots off the safety selector bar, it can pivot off, and that the sear comes up on its own spring. And again, when that happens in semi, you always want to brace this, so when it pops up, this doesn't go flying across the room. Now let's take a close look at this trigger. So the trigger is 2 axis points. This is your trigger axis when you pull it, and this is your disconnector. So as you pull the trigger, it pivots the disconnector down, and it will come off of this leg here and disconnect for semi, or it will, the selector's out of the way, it'll just pull down and you get a straight, you know, what's generally referred to as a slave sear, where the trigger and the sear are just joined together and it's just raising and lowering it, and that's it. And again, without a disconnector to flick the sear automatically, it is important, fully pull, fully release, fully pull, fully release, because feathering will damage bolts and damage sears. You'll typically see a line form, you know, almost at the top of it. That indicates that it's wearing down, and it makes the trigger really tough, because it's basically, as you're pulling down, you have a lot of friction on the bolt here, as it's, because all the mainspring is pushing forward on this bolt, and you have a lot of friction on these surfaces. As they are, they're incredibly smooth, and the finished fire control group is one of the nicest trigger pulls ever put on a submachine gun. I mean, it's a wonderfully smooth trigger pull. It does have its idiosyncrasies, but all in all, it's a solid system. And how we do these is we do all the packs to work in these fire control groups. So once a pack is standardized by us, we know that it can go in, drop in anyone's fire control group, and be ready to go. All right, back to the trigger. So let's get this disconnector out of here. And this one's looks tight, so punch. And there's our disconnector separated. Typically you never have to do this. And then we have this little guy. This is a torsion spring. And what this does is this leg on the bottom here rests on the inside frame on the trigger pack. So right in front here is where that's going to rest. And this hook-shaped thing here pushes up on the disconnector. Right there. So what that does is it keeps positive forward force on this. Now, with that in mind, you can see how that can push it forward like that. Let's go over some malfunctions. And I'll put this aside for just a sec, and we'll put it all back together. So one of the things that can happen is, if that spring in the rear breaks, let's put it on semi, this won't come, this will get stuck and won't reconnect. So it's important to make sure that you can, if you do pull the trigger out of the gun, this pack assembly out of the gun, you do want to be able to look at this and understand what's going on. And one way to check is you just pull back on this and it should reset back on that sear. That's if you want to not take all this apart. Other thing that can happen is, if you have a dead trigger, is basically your trigger gets stuck under here and just, it can't reconnect and it's not doing anything. Sometimes that could be the spring, sometimes these surfaces could get worn, or just something just breaks and you end up with a dead trigger. It's good to just be able to pull it out of the gun and take it apart and see what part is not doing what it should be doing. But there isn't that much going on here, so these are pretty easy to deal with. Let's go through reassembly. So first thing to go in will be our selector bar. And we're going to get that through the trigger guard, make sure that's flat. Next thing to go in is the fixed piece that sits on the selector bar. So I'm going to get this in here. And sometimes these are tight, and I want to line up these holes. Just using a pin punch through here to line up the holes for the mount pins. And there they are. A lot of times these are tight, but this is a lucky one where it's just loose. Oh, spoke too soon, that one's tight. So put on a flat surface, drive it in. Everything stays flat on this, so you can just run your finger across and you'll know when you're right. Let's organize the rest of the parts here. We have the sear spring, and this will go in last, and the sear pin. And we have the trigger, disconnector, trigger pin. So I want to get this disconnector put back in. And before I do that, changing out these springs can be challenging. This is a punch, this is a 16th inch punch that was ground down to a point. You'll notice one end is open, no mushing there. Another end is mushed. So you can, if you want to take this out, you can punch that out there, then replace the spring. But if I were to point out if there is an Achilles heel to this whole system, it's this one little spring. A lot relies on this doing what it needs to do, and it's a pretty small part. So disconnector back on. So line up the holes, get the pin. All right, now I got it started in the hole, I can just push it through. The issue is a lot of these older pins, they'll have squared edges, so it's hard to get them started, and there's no lead-in champers, so you have to have them perfectly lined up to go in. And like a lot of these finish designs, it's a flat to flat surface, and this is important, this stays flat too, because the inside walls of this housing keep it all together. So when this goes in here, your disconnector pin and this little guy here, your disconnector spring pin, can't flip around. This is really important, this leg here. has to be on the bottom of the trigger pack. So to put this in, I make sure this leg is up like that and get it into place like there. So now I know that the leg isn't slipping through this hole here. It is flush on the bottom. And just aligning that hole, should be able to push this in. Just make sure it's flat. And then the sear, this is where you have to be careful because this is a pretty stout spring. One more thing before I do that. Let's dump that out of there. If you find yourself, if you notice when I assembled this, I did it in the safe position, because if I put it into full, watch that disconnector, it'll dip down. It'll bury itself down like that. And once it's down like that, you have to take a tool and pull it up and pull that back to get it up on there. Because if this dips down, it just won't work. This surface can't connect back with the tail of your sear, and you'll just be stuck in that position. So understanding how this works, see, I'm pushing back on the selector here, and then I can pull up on this and just move the selector back into position. So I said that spring is the selector back. We can see this working. Next up is the detent and spring guide. Goes into this hole right here. And if you notice, there's a radiused pocket in there. So it hugs this radius here to make this extremely strong. And push that in, get it flush. And then now that I know this is not dipped down, I can rock this back and lock it in place. So if you see it hits the top of the disconnector here, I'll just lever it back, and now I'm engaged. But let's say I did something where I described what not to do. Now I'm stuck because I had it in full, and the selector bar wasn't blocking this thing from falling all the way down. So what I can do is I can just pull this up and then let it connect. And that's reassembled. So back into the lower. Back goes in first. That drops in. Just make sure everything's flat, all the pins. Your sear pin, your selector, the bar that goes on top of the selector, and that. And then this will make sure you're right, because this will fit flat to that. You'll push all the way down on this. Make sure that it's stopped fully on this surface and this surface. And you can run the screw in. I said the screw isn't necessary, but what it does is it takes out any vibration and movement in this part as it sits on there. Because these slots, if you notice, these run on slots. So it has to be a running fit, so it can't be super tight. So push that all the way down, drop that in. Screw it in place. And the most important thing, this screw always has to be tight. See how loose that is in there? If I pull the trigger, set it, it's in safe, it's not going anywhere. But if I put it to semi, dead trigger. But with this screw tightened, it pushes this whole fire control group up in the system so that the back of the sear is supported by the sear stop bar. And now I've got proper disconnector engagement. So again, quick reference. Most important thing, this screw, always fully pull, fully release, and do not feather the trigger. If anything goes wrong with these trigger packs, typically replacing individual parts within these trigger packs doesn't work too well, but we do just replace the entire pack. If a trigger pack comes back to us for service, we can service it and send it back as a complete unit ready to go in the guns, or just sell complete new trigger packs, and these will just drop in and work. All right, thanks.